Scott, you reminded me of a piece of art, actually, called the Alexamenos Graffitio, which is thought to be one of the oldest depictions of Jesus being crucified. In fact, it's not meant to be something celebrating Jesus, but rather mocking Jesus. The depiction is of a man on a cross with a donkey's head. And the original artist was trying to mock Christianity. I think they reckon they date it back to about 250 AD. I think at the time thinking that Christianity, what a stupid thing it was to worship a man on a cross. Well, 2,000 years later, we're still doing that when we join millions, if not billions, around the world, and millions, if not billions, throughout time, still worshipping Jesus, despite what the Gentiles think. It's stupid. So, yeah, think of the Alexamenos next time you think of that passage. We're not thinking about the Alexamenos today, though. We're thinking about Matthew 8. So, if you could please turn to Matthew 8, Matthew chapter 8, I'm going to start in verse 14. So, Matthew chapter 8, and start reading at verse 14. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in a bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left, and she got up and began to wait on him. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Another disciple said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." Now, I'm sure we can cycle our minds back to the spring of 2020. It was the peak days of the first lockdown, wasn't it? And it said that it was possible to go into the centre of London and to feel as though you were walking around just a sleepy village, not Europe's busiest city. Famous landmarks like Big Ben, Buckingham Palace, accustomed to millions of visitors each year, now almost only minor attractions. And none of us I'm sure will forget living through those times, extraordinary times, and likely probably for all the wrong reasons as well. However, mention the reality of those years to us back in 2018 or 2019, and I imagine many of us wouldn't have believed our ears. The idea that infection in the 21st century could literally grind our world to a near halt. It makes the idea of infection and disease now a contemporary issue, not simply a problem of the past. And last week I mentioned that since the time of Matthew's writings here, around 2,000 years ago, though great strides have been made in medicine, however, we are still plighted by our old enemy, disease, and of course what accompanies that, which is death. And like last week, we see in Matthew's Gospel another incident showing us the type of world that Jesus has entered. And the incident we come to this week, in many ways, is quite a profoundly moving scene. Look down what it says. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her. She got up and began to serve Jesus. Her mother-in-law jokes her to be put on hold. This, after all, is a life and death situation. And in the first century, fever was as feared as it is in our recent history. Even in our age, we fear fever. We are impotent in the face of rampant disease. We socially distance, we mask up, we lock down and vaccinate. And immediately in this scene, you can see the raw power of Jesus Christ. Something we saw last week. We see the raw power. He touched her hand. The fever left her. She rose. She began to serve Jesus. No consultation. No diagnosis. No drugs. No reticence. No hesitance. Peter's mother-in-law, she just gets up. Gets on with her business. Remember Boris, when he was struck with COVID, how long did it take for him to get to full strength, if ever? And now immediately she got up and she began to serve. And so we can imagine the scene that evening, people hearing about this, they brought many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast them out with a word and healed all who were sick. And if that was happening here in Withington Christian Church today, I imagine you'd have stretchers being brought in, beds being wheeled, and I imagine the car park would be pretty full, if not the roads jammed, if they heard that somebody could have this power to heal the sick. And straight away then, we mustn't underestimate the raw power of Jesus Christ when he breaks into this creation. I think we far often do underestimate it. It's possible to have too low a view of who Jesus is. I don't think it's possible to have too high a view of Jesus. I think this is a problem in our world, isn't it? No doubt many of us have seen those pictures of kind of a Victorian nursery scene with Jesus kind of dressed in a flowing white robe, looking suspiciously Western, and holding a lamb and rabbits prancing around. It's kind of quite a quaint Jesus, isn't it? A soft Jesus. But the Jesus here, though, he touched her hand. Immediately the fever left her. She rose and began to serve him. See, when Jesus bursts onto the stage of human history, he destroys disease. But Matthew wants us to see that it's much more than this. It's much more than him just destroying disease, healing people. So verse 17 is put in there by Matthew in order to get us thinking about disease and sickness. We're in part 2 of Matthew's Gospel. Part 1, chapter 3 to 7, saw the announcement of King Jesus as he arrives and declares his manifesto in the Sermon on the Mount. Part 2 begins with these 3 incidents, the 2 we saw last week and the 1 this week, incidents of raw power. He cleanses the leper, verses 1 to 4. He heals the centurion's servant, verses 5 to 13. And now Peter's mother-in-law, verses 14 to 16. And each one of these incidents, the leper, the centurion, and Peter's mother-in-law, they are examples. They're examples of the absolute authority of King Jesus over death and disease. But in each one, each incident ends with an appeal to the Old Testament scriptures. And we looked at this last week. So verse 4, the law of Moses, it testifies to King Jesus, and Jesus' accomplishment that provides the solution to what the law of Moses could only ever identify as a problem. Verse 11, the promise to Abraham is fulfilled in Jesus' rule. He brings about the promise God made to Abraham of a community, a diverse community from every nation being welcomed in as God's people. And now in this third incident, the expectation of the prophets is met in King Jesus. The law of Moses, the promise to Abraham, now the longing of the prophets. Verse 17, this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. And so Isaiah the prophet prophesied of a day when God's servant, Jesus, would tackle not simply the results of sickness, but its root cause, human sin. And in the Bible, all human suffering comes as a result of human sin. It's not that each individual sin it results in a proportionate amount of suffering. I rebel against God this much, I get this much suffering. No, it's not a transactional thing like that. We don't believe in karma. We're not Buddhists as Christians, but rather that with human rebellion against God, the very equilibrium, the balance between God and humanity is broken. And God's judgment at human rebellion, at sin, disease, and death enters into our creation. And the Apostle Paul puts it very simply like this, that the wages of our sin, of our rebellion, is death. And so suffering and sickness, disease and death, all of these come as a direct result of human rebellion against God. And Isaiah promises a day when God's servant, Jesus, will burst onto the scene of human history and remove the root cause of sickness and death. Listen to Isaiah chapter 53. This is just an excerpt from it. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. I said that this last week. Humanity turning away from God is humanity cut off from God. Humanity cut off from God is humanity under the judgment of God. Humanity under the judgment of God is humanity without life from God. And humanity without life from God is humanity perishing apart from God. Disease, sickness, and death. That the law testifies to Jesus, the one who can provide the solution to which the law can only identify as a problem. Abraham promises a day when people from every nation will come under the rule of God's great king and be blessed by him. And Isaiah here promises a day when God's servant will root out the very reason for decay and death and disease. It therefore turns out that human disease is far more deep-rooted than we maybe realize. The root of human disease it lies in human rebellion against the Creator. And human disease can only genuinely be dealt with when God's servant deals with the problem of sin and God's judgment in the world. And so here, once again, Jesus bursts onto the scene with absolute authority over disease and sickness. And Matthew, the author, says, do you remember the prophets, the promise of the prophets, the promise of Isaiah, that he will take our infirmities and bear our diseases, getting to the root cause of all that ruins this world, ruins us. And now, of course, great care has to be taken at this point. In just a moment, we're going to see that Jesus does not do this. It's not the norm in God's creation now. Death and disease isn't dealt with in this creation. He did do it when he was physically here. Why? Because he is the Lord and the one who ultimately will deliver this kingdom where death and disease no longer are rampant. But he does promise a day in the future when he will do that. Everything that ruins this creation, he will do that. So we need to exercise great care when we're thinking about this, that we don't get the timing wrong, maybe. Because Jesus, he bursts into the creation of history. He demonstrated he has the power to root out all that ruins this creation. And because we're still in this creation, it's still here. But some maybe argue that you can have freedom from death and disease now, even today. And I think we look around the world and that's not plain to see, is it? Even in this passage today, Jesus makes clear, plain that it's not available in this creation. And you can see, if you look a little bit further down in chapter 8, verse 29, where we see Jesus restoring two demon-possessed men. And listen to what the men say, possessed by demons, what they say. "What do you want with us, Son of God?" they shouted. "Have you come here to torture us or torment us before the appointed time?" So it's as if Jesus is breaking into creation ahead of time, demonstrating to us to the kind of kingdom he has to offer, the offer of actual freedom from death and disease. Here then is King Jesus. Here is his kingdom, what it would look like. Jesus arrives. He announces, "I have come to roll back disease. My rule will bring an end to all that spoils this world." And of course, because of death and disease are still a reality, it makes what Jesus has to offer of extreme relevance to us. It's something he offers in his kingdom, in his new creation. It needs no reminder, we're all facing death. Many of us, sadly, in some form or other, may suffer from disease at some point in our lives as well. And of course, we'd love these things in our world not to be there. We wish they weren't a reality. And in our lifetime, maybe with the state of science and medicine at the moment in making great strides forward, maybe we'll knock a few diseases on its head. We'll sort a few of them out, but no doubt some others will take its place. Jesus isn't offering to paper over the cracks. Rather, he's offering a new world, a new creation where death and disease and all other evil which ruins this world, which ruins us, which comes out of us as sinful human beings, he's offering us a world, promising a world where Jesus sorts that out. He has power over it. So, disease destroyed by King Jesus, a clear picture of his absolute authority. But also a pointer, Matthew is saying, is how is he going to do it? How is he going to remove disease from us? Well, think Isaiah 53. He took our infirmities and bore our diseases. The punishment we deserve was laid on him. He has dealt with the problem of human sin, and therefore he has the power to destroy human disease. Well, if disease is destroyed by Jesus, the next piece, verse 18 to 22, are an inevitable follow-on, as Jesus shows us about discipleship and what is demanded there. And they're quite fascinating few verses. Peter's mother-in-law, having been raised to serve King Jesus, is followed by two individuals who offered to follow him. And in both incidents, Jesus presses the pause button and will not allow them to follow until they really grasp what is entailed. And you might be thinking about following Jesus. You may have already decided to follow Jesus. In these two incidents, these two incidents are of great relevance to both of those people in those camps. But it's striking over and again with Jesus, where you and I might immediately have a person sign on the contract, the dotted line on the contract maybe, to join the club. Jesus presses the pause button. He won't allow unscrupulous sales tactics. He's insistent that we understand what's at stake before we sign on the dotted line, so to speak. There's no small print, if you like, in the contract of discipleship. It's all there. Jesus makes it fully clear for everyone to see. And for those who like to think of these sort of things, it's fascinating how Matthew chooses to organise his gospel, how he chooses to write it. Matthew's is quite a details person. I guess he was a bit of a money man, an accountant of some sort. And so he puts a lot of care and detail into how he organises things. And the way he's done that here is we see three supernatural incidents followed by a comment on following Jesus. Going further into chapter 8 and chapter 9, again, three supernatural incidents of Jesus, followed by a command to follow Jesus. And then after that, again in 8 and 9, again, a further three supernatural incidents. And then he sends his disciples out to recruit followers. It's amazing stuff when you consider the details and the point that Matthew is trying to make. And here Jesus tells us what it's going to look like to follow him. He's very clear. When Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And we look at this guy and we can't really blame him, can we? That he's seen all that Jesus is doing, and he's thinking, yes, I want to follow this long-promised king, the one to whom the law points to, the one whom Abraham points to, the one who the prophets point to. He's arrived. The Messiah's arrived. It's an extraordinary moment. And in response, "I will follow you wherever you go," he says to Jesus. And Jesus said to this individual, do you realize what you're promising? Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Another of the disciples said to him, "Lord, let me first go and bury my father." And Jesus told him, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." You see, in these two incidents of people wanting to follow Jesus, one individual, he promises too much too soon. "I will follow you wherever you go." And the other, he almost promises too little, too late. First, let me go and bury my father. These two incidents, they tell us as much about Jesus as they do about wannabe disciples. A couple of weekends ago, at King Charles's coronation, we had held before us a model of leadership. I'm here to serve, King Charles III, and in response we were asked to pay homage. I wonder if you did. And here the Lord Jesus holds up his model of discipleship. Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And just for that person, that first individual, we have a lot of sympathy for them, for him. He does promise quite a lot, though. This man, he's a teacher of the law. He's very conscious of what the law of Moses demands. And Jesus he's in the boat. He's going to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, into Gentile territory. This teacher knows that, and he says, well, I'll get in the boat with you. I will go with you. It's quite a big promise considering who this man is. I'll follow you wherever you go. And you're going into Gentile territory. And Jesus pauses. And he says to the individual, have you thought about what you're doing? Do you realize who I am? The title, the Son of Man, that we see in verse 20 is one of the most exalting titles given to Jesus. And in the Old Testament, it's a title that refers to one who is the judge of the living and the dead, who sits on the throne alongside Creator God, the Son of Man. Well, here, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And we talk about home improvements, don't we? Loft extensions, house and garden. We watch Escape to the Chateau, grand designs, extreme makeover, Homes in the Hammer. We think of workers' rights, environmental rights, human rights. And Jesus here, the Son of Man, it's as though he doesn't have any rights at all. Foxes have holes, birds have nests. Jesus says, I'm on the way to the cross to carry the sin of humanity, to deal with the very root cause of everything that wrecks our world. Have you realized what you're promising would be, disciple? Jesus, yes, he's going to roll back the wreckage. Yes, he will root out the reason for human disease. He will bear our infirmities. But have we reckoned what it will cost, what it will take for the Son of Man to do that? To carry God's judgment as he dies on the cross in our place. So Jesus is saying, don't promise too much too soon if you're going to walk in my footsteps. Foxes have holes, birds have nests. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And this model of tough discipleship may look obscure to us, maybe in Withington here in Manchester. But let me remind you of the reality of being a Christian in Iran right now. Of being a Christian in Russia right now. No doubt, following the cost of following Jesus resonates with them right now. Discipleship then, don't promise too much too soon. Pause, have a think. It's a glorious new creation that Jesus is promising. Disease removed, death conquered, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. But look at who we're following. But conversely, don't offer too little too late. The second individual says, first, let me go and bury my father. But Jesus told him, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. And I'm conscious my own father is in the audience today, so I'm not going to say, affirm that that's exactly what I'm going to do, but rather, and I don't think what Jesus is saying is to ignore your parents. The fifth commandment says to honor your father and mother, and elsewhere Jesus berates the disciples, the Pharisees rather, for failing to honor their father and mother. But what he is saying is ahead of every other family responsibility, King Jesus. He comes first. Following him is first. In actual fact, following Jesus looks like being a responsible family member, whatever your position in the family might be. But Jesus is first, the first priority. And for some, following Jesus, they've literally had to leave father, mother, brother, and sister in order to express their allegiance to King Jesus. A friend of mine who I knew from when I lived in London, he obeyed Jesus. He lived in a Muslim country. He found a Bible and he read it for 6 weeks straight. And by the end, he wanted to follow Jesus. So he renounced his Muslim faith. He followed Jesus. And as a result, he was told by his own father that if he saw him again, he'd kill him. The cost to him was real. And here's what my friend grasped after only a few weeks of knowing Jesus. That Jesus comes first. He is first. And he must come first in our lives. And only by the Spirit's help will we do that. I hope we see who Jesus is, what he promises for us. But I hope we also see, as Matthew would help us to see, the cost of following Jesus. Look at where Jesus is going at this point in Matthew's gospel. Not necessarily to heal all sickness in the world, but to get to the root cause of what ruins our world, with what ruins us. No mean feat. So with that, let me pray. Lord, thank you that you're a king who doesn't paper over the cracks. Lord, that you deal with the root cause, everything that ruins this world, that ruins your creation. Lord, for people, for humans who are the reason for this mess in the world, Lord, that you don't abandon them. Right from the start, you promised to save them. Even in the garden, after Adam and Eve sinned, you promised there that one day that somebody would come and crush the serpent's head, and that's Jesus, Lord. We thank you that this was your plan all along, a plan to show your glory, Lord, how loving you are, to show your character, how merciful you are. And Lord, we thank you as the recipients of that today, that we come and we can worship you, we can remember you. Help us never to forget just what you've done and what that brings us into in the new creation that's coming. Lord, help us to count the cost of what discipleship means. Just like these individuals who one promises too much too soon, the other too little too late. Lord, help us to consider what discipleship means for you. Help us to take it seriously. Lord, help us to rely on you for being disciples in your kingdom. And Lord, keep us faithful to you. Keep us following you in a world which hates you, which thinks the message of the gospel is folly. Keep us faithful to your work, to your most glorious moment in history, which was you, arms stretched out on a cross, dying for humanity, taking its sin. And we thank you for that, and keep us faithful to that. Help us to be your disciples. Amen.